recap time. Part 1, truth matters. There's evidence for God, but all we got was bad arguments. Part 2, hey, the universe is contingent, but God isn't. Just trust me, bro. No proof of any of that. Just philosophical mumbo jumbo. Whee! And now for part 3.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today. Today is part 3 of my cumulative case for Christian theism. Today we're going to be looking at the phenomena of design. So, just to get things started, in part 1 we talked about the importance of truth and why we should pursue truth, along with showing that truth is like noble and something we can find. In part 2, I argued that there is some sort of necessary foundation that's responsible for our universe. And in part 3, I'm going to begin to build my case that it's God, starting with the nature of design.
Design. Because design requires a designer, just like reality requires a realtor. How does one identify design? What makes one thing designed and another thing not designed? But, of course, with theism, everything is technically designed, so there would be nothing that you could point to as an example of something that wasn't designed, breaking down any and all analogies like the watchmaker argument, for example. If you ask Google how to identify the principles of design, you get that there are 12 basic principles of design: contrast, balance, emphasis, proportion, hierarchy, repetition, rhythm, pattern, white space, movement, variety, and unity. But he's not talking about that version of design. Okay, well, what about just the word design? To create, fashion, execute, construct according to plan, devise, contrive, design a system for tracking inventory, to conceive and plan out in the mind. He designed the perfect crime to have as a purpose, to intend. What do we mean by design? And if we're going to have design, well, then we're going to have good design and bad design. And certainly we can say when something has a bad design. Why, here's an example of bad design now. The way that we eat and breathe. You see, the tubes that we use to breathe and eat are right next to each other. And so sometimes when you eat, you get stuck in the tube where you need to breathe from, making it impossible to breathe, and then you choke to death. That's terrible design. That's just really bad. Why would you do that? Okay, so God's a bad designer. Who cares? As long as it's a designer, that's really all that matters. Of course, we're going to have to admit that God's a bad designer, which I'm totally sure that Zach will do. What? Well, no, he doesn't do that?
So, I'm starting off with Genesis 1:4, where it says, "And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness." This verse, when I read it, just to me shows that God's creating some sort of like order and structure to the universe. And this is going to be the basis of a design argument.
Are you kidding me right now? You're really going to start with a circular argumentation? That's your starting point, Zach? You haven't established that the Bible is anything that we should care about, that's reliable or true in any way. And then to add on to that problem, you're using your own personal interpretation of that particular verse to launch things from? Are you serious? Oh my word! Wow! 2 fallacies out the gate. Whee! Okay. Wow. Let me start with hammering at your interpretation. Why is light good? What's good about light? What is light exactly here? And why is it good? Does that mean that darkness is bad? But darkness isn't even a thing. You can't separate light and darkness, because darkness isn't a thing that you can separate things from. Neither is light, really. Light is a property that can only exist due to something else. So light by itself is also not a thing. But that's if I interpret this to be literal, which I do, but you don't. So whose interpretation is right, Zach? And of course, your circular argumentation, well, really, we shouldn't have to explain to you why you shouldn't use circular argumentation, right? Because circular argumentation is bad.
Obviously, perhaps the most famous design argument comes from William Paley with the divine watchmaker analogy. And a little quote from him says that the inference we think is inevitable. He's referring to the inference of design, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some point and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer.
It's really hard to understand why in the world anybody would use the watchmaker argument anymore, seeing as how it's been debunked plenty of times. The analogy is completely and utterly broken because if all you had to compare the watch to was other things that were also designed, you couldn't make the analogy. The whole point is you're supposed to say, hey, nature is over here and the watch is here and the watch looks designed and nature doesn't. This is the intelligent design trial all over again. We know that this doesn't work. This is not applicable to human life or any other life for that matter. Why in the world would you bring it up? Is that really the best you have? Is a broken analogy?
And this is the basis of the design arguments. We're looking at levels of complexity in detail of the universe that suggest that there is some sort of design. We aren't here by chance or anything along these lines, but there actually is some sort of like good reason to think that there would have to be some sort of designer.
I've noticed that some theists really have a hang up with this by chance terminology. And they always seem to admit the filtering mechanism that life has, mainly death. But we're talking about the universe. But there's also life and death in the universe, just not in the biological sense. Stars live for a while and then they die, and that causes other things to happen. And the mechanistic way that that all falls into place, is that chance? To some extent, but also to some extent it can't be any other way because things have to happen in certain ways because of the laws of physics. So by leaving that filtering mechanism out, you acquire the logical fallacy of half truth. Additionally, all this is a redux of the broken watchmaker argument, no longer applied to biology, but instead applied to cosmology. It didn't work there. Why would you think it would work over here?
Two premises. Premise one is that the design of the universe is more likely on theism than atheism.
And premise one dies. There is no design. Not even a little. It can appear designed, but it's not. You'd have to demonstrably demonstrate that it is in fact designed. So premise one assumes the conclusion, meaning that this is a circular argumentation.
So design is evidence for theism. So this isn't some sort of proof for like you look at like Craig's design argument or like hey like fine tuning's real. There's no atheistic explanation, so there must be a God. Rather, I just want to say that the design of the universe is going to be some evidence for theism, because it's more likely on theism that there would be this design than on atheism. So why use this approach? I believe that there are no clear proofs that establish theism or atheism. So in the absence of these proofs, we need a different way of looking for the best explanations of things.
If there's no clear proofs that establish theism, then one should doubt that theism is correct. However, when you say there's no clear proofs to establish atheism, I'm not exactly sure what you're thinking that atheism is. Perhaps you think that atheism is the idea that there is no God, which it can be, but it isn't necessarily. How about this? If we want to categorize theism to be that there is a God and atheism to be that there isn't God, and you want another option, then be a skeptic. It's not true that there is a God. It's not true that there isn't a God. What is true is that I do not know which there is. Therefore, I will remain skeptical until I have evidence one way or the other. Of course, that does mean that I don't actively believe in God, so that technically makes me an atheist, rendering your position here moot. But but at least you have a third option, kind of.
In my arguments that I'm going to use for the most of the rest of this book, I'm going to look at certain phenomena and argue that if these facts are more likely to be true if God exists than if God does not exist, then we have good reason to believe that God exists. If there's 5 good reasons to believe God exists and 2 good reasons to believe that God does not exist, it seems like that there's going to be a really good reason to think that God in fact does exist. So the project of the rest of this book slash presentation is just to build a cumulative case for the existence of God and extend this case to Christianity.
And if I keep adding things to this pile will become true. And if I keep taking things away from this pile will become false. The cognitive bias here is striking. Of course, you're going to keep adding things to the scale that weighs towards the thing that you want to believe. And that's not really the way that we should go about discovering what is true, which you said in your first video that you care about. But I don't really think that that's exactly the case. I think that it is the case that you care about what you believe rather than what you can demonstrate. What you can demonstrate doesn't require there to be things that point one way or the other. It just requires evidence at all. Any evidence, which you don't have when it comes to theism. All you have is bad arguments. So, why do you continue to think that there are things to stack in the favor of theism? Because you want to continue to believe that theism is correct because of your cognitive bias. If you sought to instead disprove your idea, well, then you would become a skeptic, which is what I did. And since we're mentioning books, I guess I'd say it's in my book, Caught Between an Infinite Hope and a Finite Despair, available on Amazon. Go get it now, now, now!
So all I'm trying to do is like add a bunch of evidential chips to the theistic side from here, looking at different phenomena and saying, hey, these are a lot more expected on like theism, the idea that there is some sort of God versus atheism. So that's my argument.
And your argument is incoherent because on atheism isn't a thing at all. Atheism doesn't provide any description about anything other than what one doesn't believe. What you mean to say perhaps here is naturalism, materialism, secularism, or something like that. But it's a common error that apologists make.
So first we have to ask, is the universe designed? So there's a couple ways we're going to look at this. And the first way is looking at scientific evidence suggesting design. So obviously the fine-tuning argument is very popular and we can get into like all the crazy amounts of like constants and things like that. But I just want to give you a general survey of what's going on here when we talk about fine-tuning. So the cosmological constant describes the expansion of the universe's acceleration. Robin Collins writes regarding the cosmological constant, quote, without fine-tuning or some new principle of physics, the cosmological constant is expected to be at least 10 to the 53 to 10 to the 120th times larger than the maximum life permitting value, end quote. That's a pretty big number, 10 to the 120th. Even if you go to that little number, 10 to the 53, we're looking at a really, really, really big number. So explaining the reason for the value of the cosmological constant is known as one of the biggest challenges facing modern cosmology. If the cosmological constant was much larger, as it's expected to be, the universe would expand too fast and not permit any galaxies to form. If there are no galaxies, there are no stars, and without stars, there would be no planets, most likely. And without planets, the possibility for the development of life looks grim. So when we're looking at the cosmological constant, we're saying, hey, there's this constant that kind of governs the expansion of the universe. And if it was different than the way it is, and we're looking at it and it's very unexpected that it is the way it is, we don't got galaxies. And without galaxies, we don't got stars. And without stars, we don't got planets. And we don't have planets. Ooh, those other forms of life or life in general, it's not looking too hot.
Life requires planets? Why should that be the case? Now, the only life that we know for sure is our life, the life of all the creatures here on Earth. Tardigrades, the amazing, interesting creatures that they are pretty much everywhere. And yeah, they can survive in space for a while, but not indefinitely. And certainly, we haven't found any life anywhere else just yet. Granted, we haven't been able to look very far, but still. If this whole idea that the universe is just so well tuned for life was actually a thing, well, then shouldn't we find life just everywhere, including in outer space? But we don't. Which either means that it's somewhere else, not here, that we're not looking for it in the right way, that we don't recognize it, or, okay, this isn't a dichotomy at all. This is like a quadrotomy of possibilities, and then some. But for sure, life as we know it needs a planet, and a sun, and water, and a bunch of other stuff. We don't know what sort of life would be possible or could be possible given some other universe. These extrapolations about what a universe might be like if things were different is just that, extrapolation. We don't know unless the model has been created. And as far as I know, no computer simulation has ever been done to show what our universe would be like from beginning to now, let alone some other proposed universe would look like from beginning to now. And without that computer simulation, well, we have speculation. But even with that computer simulation, we'd still have rampant speculation. And that's a problem if you're going to be a skeptic. Of course, if you're going to be a believer, it's not a problem because you can just believe what you want and believe that you have the right answer. Of course, the universe is fine tuned for, well, not life exact. It's fine. If it was different, then the solar system wouldn't be. It would spread out too fast, and then life probably couldn't form, and then we wouldn't be here. But wait a minute, don't you guys believe in a spiritual existence? Why do we need a physical universe at all? If a non-physical existence is possible, why not be there? Why not start there? Why not be created there? What's so special about a physical universe? Exactly. What can you get out of a physical universe that you couldn't also get out of a spiritual universe? A universe where it was clearly evident that God existed. Of course, the apologist has plenty of reasons why God has to remain hidden, reasons that don't make a lot of sense, but nonetheless, if you were in a spiritual universe, God still could be hidden to some extent if it needed to be for whatever bizarre reason. But at least then you would have, well, a different type of universe, different sorts of physics that would apply. Unless, of course, no physics applied because it was not solid. I'm not sure how a universe without any sort of laws would work, meaning that the spiritual universe has to have some sort of spiritual laws that govern it. But it doesn't have anything that's physical that governs it. So, how does any of that work? Perhaps the only sort of universe that can work is the sort of universe that we have, or something close enough to it. If a different universe developed where solar systems spread out too quickly, that universe would fail, essentially, or at least fail to produce life. Thus, we wouldn't be in that sort of universe. To summarize this whole long thing that I've just said, if things were different, things would be different. But they're not. They're the way they are. To extrapolate from that and say, well, they could have been different, is kind of a moot point. Yeah, they could have been different, but they're not. But why is it this way? That's just the way it is. We can't ask that why question. We can only answer the how question. And that might very well be a mystery that science has yet to unravel. But the moment it does, well, then what are you going to do? You're only going to have to move the goalpost back so that God can fill an ever receding gap that has been filled with new knowledge. Isn't that interesting? God can only exist where we don't know the answer to stuff. Why is that exactly?
So this question of like, why is the cosmological constant the way it is? That's one example of design. Another example that Collins talks about is different laws of nature which must exist to allow complex life to exist. These factors include things such as gravity and the strong nuclear force, which bind molecules together. Without gravity, there would be nothing to hold together stars, planets, or us. And without the strong nuclear force, no complex molecules would be able to develop, which in turn would prevent intelligent life from developing. Molecules seem necessary for life, as you and all other living organisms are made up of them. Without molecules, the building blocks leading to you and me would not exist. So, again, when we're looking at design, we're trying to wonder, like, we're looking at these things that are governing the universe and like the building blocks that are leading to life. If these things seem to be fine tuned, like it's unlikely they come to existence. But only this question of like, ooh, this is kind of suspicious. So
All you're doing here is an appeal to ignorance and an appeal to personal incredulity. I don't know how it works. Can't believe it would work any other way. Therefore, it's gotta be this.
also, in addition to the scientific phenomena, where you can look at different constants and argue that there's fine tuning, there's also philosophical evidence to suggest that the universe is designed. So let's just think for a second that God doesn't exist, and the foundation of reality is something indifferent, such as quantum particles, energy, matter, or something else along these lines. All things being equal, there's no reason to think that the universe would be hospitable to life. If the foundation is indifferent, there's no reason to think that the universe would allow for intelligent life to exist, even assuming the possibility of an evolutionary process.
What the hell is philosophical evidence?
But why on earth would this be the case? One way to think about this is through the idea of possible universes. From the armchair, we can imagine many different ways that things could have played out. What if the South won the Civil War? What if Tom Brady was drafted by the Steelers? What if Adolf Hitler never existed? In all these scenarios, the world could have played out differently than the one we are living in. We can imagine how things could have played out differently from the power of our own reason. For me, just sitting in my chair, we can think about all the different possible ways the world could have came about. Similarly, we can reflect on the possible ways the universe could have played out. Many possible universes would just end in chaos, with no life existing at all. We can easily conceive of a world where only two atoms exist, or the space is an empty void with no life within it. When I reflect on the different ways the world could have been, it seems as if there's only a small fraction of the worlds that would allow for intelligent life to exist, whereas worlds without intelligent life would be much more common.
Yes, seems to be. I can imagine. Yes, you can imagine a lot of things, including God, but that doesn't make those things real or even possible. Any universe that existed without life wouldn't have life there to wonder why it was there. It's the weak anthropic principle. All you're doing is appealing to your personal ignorance to say, I just don't know. And then you're appealing to personal incredulity. I can't think of any other answer. It's got to be the answer that I want it to be. It has to be God. It just can't be anything else because I just can't understand it. If you can actually apply your imagination this well, then certainly you could come up with a universe that didn't have God and that came about by natural phenomenon and is exactly the way that we perceive it today. What would really be the difference between a physical universe like we have and a physical universe with a God hidden in some non physical way that actually made everything else? If the two are identical, then why posit God at all?
This means that our universe at least appears to be designed because it's unlikely that there would be a universe that supports the existence of life.
And one giant non sequitur does not follow. Hey, look, it's so complicated. It's irreducibly complex. It can't have been just by chance. Wait a minute. Doesn't that sound exactly like the anti evolutionists in regards to evolution? except applied to cosmology. Pretty sure I said that earlier in this video, but it bears repeating and it repeats bears. Roar. Wait, what? Oh, bears! Ah, run away! Bears! Ah!
So what I'm trying to get at is just think about these two ideas. One is theism and God exists, and the other one is atheism, where God does not exist. And I'm focusing on atheism here. And I'm trying to say that it's very unlikely that we'd see a universe like ours given atheism.
It's really unlikely based on that people don't believe in God. I mean the other version of atheism, the one that says there is no God. Based on the idea that there's no God, it's really unlikely. I don't have any proof of that, but I'm just gonna say that that's the case.
Because just think about all the different ways the universe could have come about. Maybe there's one atom, or two atoms, or three atoms, or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 100. Maybe there's just like a microphone floating around in space. It seems like given atheism, you have to epistemically allow for all these things to be at least conceivably possible. Obviously, people wouldn't say it's metaphysically possible necessarily. And because of that, when you just think of all the different ways things could have gone, there's a bunch more than what there's no life than that there's complex life such as you and me.
Just think about all the ways that the crystals could have turned out, but didn't turn out. Isn't that amazing? They might have been just some other thing. But the fact that they're crystals, that means there's something special about them. And that must mean that the crystals, therefore, grant certain properties to humans with their energy and wavelengths and such. And that different crystals have different powers because think of all the ways that the crystals could have not been. Therefore, it must be that the crystals are magic.
So, why is this design more likely on theism than atheism? So, let's say there's scientific and philosophical reason to think that there is, in fact, design.
Let's not say that because it's not true. There's no scientific reason to call it design, and the philosophy is weak at best, and well, when you put it into argumentation form, has logical fallacies, so has to be discarded in full. So, no, why would we entertain this thought at all?
Put simply, given atheism, there's no reason for the foundation of produce a universe with life over a universe without life. Nothing given the hypothesis of atheism predicts that there'd be a universe with human beings or a universe with just a couple of atoms floating around.
Assume that there is no God. Well, we don't really need to do that because it, there isn't any reason to think that there is a God so far. You haven't given us any. So let's just assume that the laws of nature that we understand are functional in the past. And that's a decent enough assumption. And it works until we get to a very small universe where physics as we know it would obviously break down and change. Now we have to have different assumptions about that. We could just assume that physics continues to work the way that we think it does, or we could assume that physics works slightly differently. And we could base our predictions based on those assumptions, and if they pan out, then they would be decent enough theories. And at no point would we ever need to assert God to explain any of that. In fact, asserting God is something that would actually be contrary to making decent predictions because God could do anything it wanted, including making a universe that couldn't support life but that had life in it anyways, because God could do whatever the bleep it wants, including having absolutely no evidence for itself because reasons.
So, given atheism, at least epistemically, I think we'd have to say that like all possible universes would have a probability, and maybe even probability, because there's just no reason for the foundation for one universe over another, given like a mere atheism. So, if this is the case, a universe without life is more likely to exist given atheism, where the foundation is indifferent. Do there be many more possible ways where there is no life than there is a universe with life?
Alright, I didn't want to have to do this, but since we're just proposing things without any proof at all, I propose infinite universes. There. Now we have infinite possibility of life. Checkmate.
However, if there is a God, there's reason for God to prefer a universe with life over a universe without life. If there's a perfect God like the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews hold to, it makes sense that God would create beings who are able to reflect Him in abilities such as power, rationality, and value. This is because these beings would be good to create. Human beings have more valuable than a rock or an atom or something else along those lines.
Why? would those things have more value to God? In what way? Why is a human more important than a rock to God? Both, from God's perspective, took the same amount of energy to make. Why is one more valuable than the other? Because one has sentience and the other doesn't? And why couldn't you grant sentience to the rock? Then it would be as valuable as the other thing. In fact, why not grant sentience to everything? Then everything would have the equal value. Why would there be a value hierarchy at all? If God's always going to be on top of that value hierarchy, which apparently it is, and then angels, I suppose, are somewhere under that, and then we are under angels, aren't we? Or are we actually above angels in importance? Then why make angels? There's so many questions that just can't be answered at all when it comes to hypothesizing on how God functions, because all of it is just completely cobbled together from theology that you're assuming to be correct, that you've utterly failed to demonstrate is actually correct.
I argue that a perfect being would create, if anything, good things. It is likely that God would create a universe because creating moral agents like us is a good thing to do. Since life is good, a universe hospitable to life would be more likely than a universe inhospitable to life, given theism.
When you say good, I have to really wonder what the bleep you think good means. Because if Christianity is true, then there's a hell as well. And according to some rough calculations using ChatGPT, I got to about 92 to 97 billion non Jewish, non Christian individuals that have ever existed. They're all in hell. Even if we rounded that down to 90 billion people, 90 billion people sitting in hell forever and all time because they were the wrong religion. How the bleep is that good? Even if it was just one, to me, that's still evil. Last time in part 2, I ended and said that if you wanted me to, I would do the rest of that video for some amount of money. And I was pretty jaded at that time, and if I came off sounding a little bit frustrated, I apologize, but the bottom line is, with this video, he basically repeats the same fallacies over and over again. I've already covered everything that it's worth covering. He just appeals to more ignorance, more personal incredulity. He asserts things without proof, and he continually makes the same pleas to that life means God. Because it just does. He also talked a little bit about the multiverse and basically said, well, there's no evidence that that's a thing, and then if there was evidence that there was a thing like that, then it would just make fine-tuning even more difficult somehow because reasons. Yeah, it's nothing really worth covering in depth. Trust me on this. So, look, the amount of logical fallacies that we already have is sufficient for us to be skeptical of his conclusion. But I think that the problem goes deeper. The problem here is he started with an assumption and ended with the same assumption he started with. And he'll do anything and everything to try to defend that, even though it's undefensible. He'll misquote and cherry pick science when it suits him to do so, and he'll use bad logic, ignoring the fact that it's bad. He'll speak of things like philosophical evidence, which isn't even a thing, and he'll say things that just are incoherent. But that's all he's got is bad arguments. He doesn't have any empirical evidence, repeatable test, or a valid and sound argument. And I don't think that he's going to next time either. But I'm still going to cover it because it's a thing to do. But I might also cut that short at the end if he continually repeats the same fallacies over and over again towards the end, which is what he's done here, and leaves me nothing more to say than, well, he did that, and then I guess I could say, hey, if you want me to cover more, you could pay me, but nobody's going to pay me any money to do this. That's crazy talk. I'll charge less than I did last time. $50 this time instead of 100 last time. And then, like, the next video will go down to like 25. And then,
So my argument today is pretty simple.
and then that